Hello, thanks for joining us today for this video on our new US flood data. My name is Sampson. I'm one of the directors and founders at Fathom, and I'm joined by Dr. Niall Quinn, who's one of our senior developers. If you're watching this video, I'm sure you're already aware that flood is an enormous problem both in the US and across the world. And according to NOAA, flood has caused about $1 trillion worth of inflation-adjusted losses since 1980 in the US. So it's a very material problem for all sorts of different practitioners. And to date, data availability has been limited for a number of reasons. And this is something that we've been actively trying to address over the last few years. Our new 2020 release of flood hazard data covers the three primary drivers of flood in the US. These are pluvial, so surface water flooding from intense rainfall, fluvial, so river-based flooding, and for the first time in our data, coastal flooding, which is the interaction between tidal action and atmospheric storm surge. So a quick summary of the three data sets, starting with fluvial data. The model runs at 10-meter resolution nationwide, and all channels are explicitly represented within the model, down to a very small catchment size. So in the fluvial model, this is about 50 square kilometers. We have full coverage of the contiguous US, and we use local data wherever available. So we use the USGS stream gauge record to derive our river flows, and this is regionalized using a statistical method. The model simulates 10 return periods from high frequency events, such as the 1 in 5 year, through to very rare large scale events, such as the 1 in 1,000 year. And in something we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a minute, we have a very comprehensive representation of flood defenses within this model. The pluvial component of the model is again represented on a 10-meter resolution grid, and the same set of return periods from the 5 year to the 1,000 year are represented. One of the critical differences is that there is no minimum catchment size for the pluvial model. And this is because in a lot of small headwater areas, it is intense rainfall events that drive risk. And so this ensures that the model has complete coverage for the entire US, and there's no piece of land that isn't covered by the overall data set. As with the fluvial model, we leverage local data because availability is so good in the US. So we use the NOAA intensity, duration, frequency curves to define the rainfall intensities that are associated with an event of a given magnitude.
So the coastal model is our latest addition to the Fathom modeling framework. And it really uses the same ethos as the inland, fluvial, and pluvial models, in that we try to garner as much information as possible that's available throughout the US. So the primary source of information for the coastal model is, of course, the dense gauge network provided by NOAA. We use that to distinguish our non-hurricane tide surge water levels. But I think the most important component of this coastal model is that we explicitly represent the uncertainty that comes with trying to characterize low frequency events such as hurricanes using relatively short historic data sets. To get around this, we leverage thousands upon thousands of years of synthetic hurricane tracks. We put them through a coastal hydraulic model, and in doing so, we generate many thousands of years of plausible hurricane-based storm surge water levels. We can then simulate those with our non-hurricane water levels to generate a synthetic set that we believe is more representative of the possible range of water levels you could see within the 2020 and future time periods. This work is primarily a collaboration between ourselves and colleagues at MIT and the Rhodium Group.
As mentioned, flood defenses are a critical part of any model of risk in the US. And it's a real challenge because the federal flood defense database is very incomplete. Estimates are that about 2/3 of the defenses are actually missing from the government's own database. And we can see from the image of Sacramento on the screen here just how important that is. So we put a lot of work into improving this database and expanding it. We funded a PhD that looks into it, and we published journals on automated methods to do this. But also, we've started to work with FEMA and the US Army Corps of Engineers themselves in order to better identify the key features of levees within the data set, such as overtopping frequencies. And this really has given us access to unprecedented levels of data to incorporate into a model framework such as this. A further step in this process was collaboration with the First Street Foundation project, which gave us access to significant human resource for identification and characterization of flood defense features, as well as other aspects of model performance. This worked at the form of a formal feedback loop, whereby we delivered an initial run of the model. This was then analyzed by a team of analysts in New York who pulled together as much information as they could about flood behavior in each state. So this was looking at FEMA, looking at local records, looking at press coverage, claims histories, talking to local water managers, and pulling all of that information together. They then fed the results back to us, and it enabled us to identify areas where the model was not behaving as expected and adjust calibration. So what does all this mean for model performance? Well, a couple of years ago, we undertook a national scale analysis in collaboration with Google to evaluate the performance of our first variant of the model. And this research was published in an award-winning paper. And we showed that where FEMA data existed, our data matched it extremely well. However, as with all models, there were elements that could be improved and needed to be improved. This included model behavior in coastal regions and model behavior at high frequencies. And these were the key focus points of the development we've been doing over the last couple of years. A systematic validation of the new data has shown consistent improvement for these key metrics. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, so please feel free to pause the video and take a look at it. It will also all be published in detail in a journal paper that's currently being written. But in summary, we validated the new model relative to the old model against the very high quality flood maps available from the Iowa Flood Center, against every model in the FEMA database that FEMA themselves classify as being high quality. And we also did a bit of novel validation against the NFIP claims database. So in summary, you can see from these statistics that the critical success index for model behavior, which is a measure of model performance that takes into account both over and under prediction, has improved across the board, which is of course something that we're very pleased to see. The NFIP analysis is interesting. It shows that the proportion of the building stock within the 1 in 5 year floodplain in our model has reduced from 3.3% in our old version to 1.7% in the new version. This is interesting because the 1 in 5 year claims rate within the NFIP database is 1.76%. So this indicates that the new model is behaving in a more realistic manner than the old model at high frequencies. And we knew that this was important from our own internal analysis and from interaction with our insurance clients who are already using the older data.
So although the critical success index is the most commonly used metric when assessing models, I think particularly in the coastal zone, looking at the hit rate and the error bias is also really interesting. So we see in the old model, the error bias shows a really strong tendency for the model to underpredict. This is also shown in hit rate. In the new model, we see that the error bias actually shows slight tendency to overestimate. I think what this indicates is that having a representative coastal boundary is extremely important to the model, both in terms of representing that storm surge, but also correctly representing the fluvial component in those regions. It's not a huge surprise to me that we see some degree of overestimation in the new model coastal zone. So you have to remember what we're comparing is FEMA estimates of flood, routinely based on historical analysis, against our new model, which includes a much wider representation of the potential hurricanes that could impact these regions.
So why is this important? Well, as alluded to earlier, the open FEMA catalog isn't perfect. In fact, over 40% of the country is not modeled at all. And in those areas that do have coverage, a lot of the models are out of date and FEMA themselves flag them as being low quality. So in our analysis in the previous slide, we restrict ourselves to comparing to the more recent models that FEMA claim to be high quality and of engineering standard. Diving into this a little bit further, we can see that even in areas that FEMA claim to map, their modelling is often restricted to larger waterways and rivers. And this is simply a property of the modelling techniques and software packages that are typically used in FEMA studies. We can see that where our data and FEMA data coexist, they look very similar indeed. But on the map shown on the screen now, you can see that a lot of the smaller headwaters and what the insurance market might term off floodplain areas simply aren't covered by the FEMA model. In a study that we published in collaboration with the US Environmental Protection Agency, we calculated that there is approximately threefold difference between our estimate of exposed population and the FEMA estimate of exposed population. And really, this is only the beginning of the story, because if we look into the future using the EPA's own estimates of future urban development, we can see that the number of people exposed to flooding as we move through the century steadily increases. And this analysis was entirely independent of climate change. So flood hazard was held constant, and we were just looking at changes in exposure. However, we know that this is not the case. The climate is not stationary, and it is changing. And so in the last part of this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing in collaboration with a number of institutes around the world to look at how climate change is affecting flood risk in the US, both today and into the future.
So for our analysis of the change in climate and to work out what the future hazard might hold, we leverage GCM ensembles, synthetic hurricane track sets defined for the current and future GCM ensembles, as well as mean sea level rise estimates provided by Kopp et al. 2014. And what we do is we use those data sets to create change factors. These change factors represent a proportional change in the driving boundary conditions for pluvial, fluvial, and coastal extreme sea levels. We can use that information to generate new hazard layers to then infer what our hazard will be in the future. Because we're using ensembles of data, we can also characterize what the uncertainty around our projections are. So we can answer questions not only of what's the change between historic to 2020 to 2050 median estimates of change, we can also say, what's our uncertainty in how we've characterized that hazard? The research paper we're currently preparing for publication aims to outline not only the methods that have gone into developing this vast US model, but also highlight some of the changes we expect to see across the US in terms of hazard. So one of the more unsurprising changes we see is in the coastal zone, a rise in mean sea level is causing heightened risk to coastal communities. But it's not just mean sea level that's important. We can also see an intensification of hurricane activity, particularly as you move up the eastern seaboard, placing communities like New Jersey and New York in even greater risk. From a fluvial and pluvial perspective, we see much the same. And overall, considering all drivers, we see particularly in the west and along the east coast, we see the greatest change in hazard, with central US showing much slower rates of increased flood zone when you consider the 100-year hazard layers. The analysis reveals that although you see an increase in flood hazard throughout the US, within the coastal regions, this is disproportionately large. The example shown here is in Baytown, Texas. We can see the left-hand image shows our 2020 100-year layer relative to the FEMA flood zones. It shows a good match, which fills us with confidence to how well our model is performing. The right-hand image in the red zone shows how that 100-year layer is expected to increase in 2050 due to a rise in sea level and hurricane intensification, leading to the breaching of existing defense structures.
We're really excited about the release of this data. As I hope the video has shown, there's been an awful lot of work go into it, not just from ourselves, but also from our colleagues at different institutions and organizations across the world. Now, clearly, the data is going to have significant application within the private market and insurance market, and we hope that it makes a really material change for practitioners operating in those spaces. However, it's also going to be made publicly available to homeowners across the US through our friends at the First Street Foundation. And we hope and believe this will be very empowering to large groups of people who, if they were not living before now in a FEMA flood zone, did not have any access to information about risk to their properties. Finally, we are engaging with researchers from many different fields at many different organizations and universities to look at this data through a number of different lenses: social, economic, cultural, historical. And it will be very, very interesting to see the trends and patterns that emerge through this work over the coming years. So thanks for watching this. We hope that you're as interested and excited by the data as we are. Clearly, this video has been a fairly quick introduction to it. So if you do have any more questions about it, please don't hesitate to get in touch.